Hello, this is Dr. J, and we're delighted to have you with us again for our study in Deuteronomy, coming now to chapter 14 that begins a special section about some of the distinctions that Moses is teaching his people to put into practice when they arrive in the promised land. I call it a holy people and part one because this is going to go on for more than one study. It's common known that my favorite hymn is Holy, Holy, Holy. Boy, I can get caught up in it. It just gives a great vision of heaven, a lot of what John sees in the book of Revelation, the angels and saints bowing down before the Lord. He's high, he's holy, there's brilliance, there's magnificence about it, and there's such purity of what holiness means. We think about it in those terms, but the Bible also says that we're supposed to be holy. There's a holiness about us. And so we find this instructed of God's people and how that holiness distinction shows itself in these weeks that we'll share together. At the very top of your listening guide, which I hope you got from the church office or from our website, the special studies page that is there, I have the opening verses of chapter 14. You are the children of the Lord your God. Do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead. I'm just going to pause there and say that was probably something the pagans did. And so God has said, and we'll talk about this a lot today, don't worship the way the pagans did. And so some of their practices, don't implement them. In verse 2, you are a people holy, there's that word, holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possessions. And I think we all would recognize enough of our brokenness and our sinfulness to be thought of as holy is a bit of a stretch, we might think. But we are called to be holy. And so I want to tell you a few things that I think to remember when we think about being holy. What does it mean to be holy? First, to be holy is a privilege we do not deserve and we cannot earn. It's our salvation that we are made holy. It's not something we acquire or we attain, we earn. God's obligated to give us because of our goodness. We have plenty of badness. And so it is the grace that we have any holiness within us now, and certainly complete holiness in eternity in heaven. Second, to be holy is to be healthy. And as we'll see, some of the distinctions that God makes for his people really is going to make them a healthier people. There'll be some physical health that will take place. We'll look in their diet here in a moment. They're in the kosher diet is a healthier than average diet. I think also some relational health, emotional health, spiritual health that will take place, of course, because of the distinction that we have. And then last, to be holy is to be different. Those distinctions, it's otherness that we have. It's different than the other things that are there, that there's a distinction that is made upon us. Now, I see studies occasionally where it tells that the moral and ethical life and lifestyles of those who proclaim to be Christians is just about parallel with those in general society. It makes me sad. We need to be better than that. I do tend to see that those who are very active and serious about their faith do have a distinction about the way they live, and that is compared to the common population that is around them. So there is an encouragement that takes place in there. But we're going to look at multiple topics where Moses says you are to be holy, you're to be distinct. And the first one is, as I implied a minute ago, is in our diet. The distinction between clean and unclean. And before we get into the weeds of Deuteronomy 14 about what's clean and unclean that you should eat and you shouldn't eat, I want us to have a New Testament perspective on this. Because fortunately, in the New Testament, the dietary laws are said that we don't have to follow those anymore. Jesus noted in Mark, I want to make sure, before getting to the specifics, remember the New Testament puts a different approach to what someone should or shouldn't eat. Jesus says, nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. We have a very familiar story in Acts chapter 10 where Peter has a vision of different animals that come down from heaven, and it says, then the voice said, get up, Peter, kill and eat. Surely not, Lord, Peter replied. I've never eaten anything impure or unclean. The voice spoke to him a second time, do not call anything impure that God has made. And of course, this is part of a lesson that God's showing to Peter, that there is a Gentile, a Roman soldier, a centurion named Cornelius who's coming to see him. And so respect him. The grace of God is upon him, and his salvation is going to be just as legitimate as anyone who has a Hebrew background. Paul, writing in the church at Corinth that was having some debate about whether you should eat meat where a part of that animal had been offered in idol worship, says, but food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, no better off if we do. And so we just to make sure we understand that we can have a different diet than those people in the Old Testament were instructed to do so. Now, clean and unclean animals, I don't think it has anything to do with the intrinsic value of the animals themselves, that God loves certain animals and he calls them clean more than he loves the animals that he calls unclean. As we'll see, there's really just a mystery. We're going to give some speculation about why some things are clean and some things are unclean. But it's a mystery. I guess the bottom line is because God says so, these are clean and unclean, but we can maybe find some hints in what we say. One is, and it's on your blank, it is possible some unclean creatures were associated with pagan worship. And we've studied already here that God says you don't worship the way the pagans did. You don't borrow their practices and put them into your practices of me. So there may be some distinctions about the pagan worships, the worship of Baal and Asherah and the things that were involved that says to the people, this is why they're unclean, because it's used in the worship of the pagan god. So for an example, this is a fairly familiar admonition later in the chapter, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. And again, that could be that's part of a pagan ritual, and so don't do that. I also kind of like some of my research that said, God has given that mother goat the milk to sustain her young, not to kill her young, and so respecting God's intention for the milk to be given. So that's an intriguing thought, isn't it, of an explanation of this. I can tell you that today, when I've taken groups to Israel, we stayed in Jewish-owned hotels and eaten at restaurants, that they do not serve dairy with meat because of this admonition. They're afraid don't make the mistake. It's being guarded, so we don't want to make sure that we're not, maybe by accident, serving the meat that came from and the dairy that came from the mother and the child of the same animal. Here's what I think before we get into the specific dietary laws, okay? It is likely God declared some creatures unclean as a means of teaching his people to exercise discernment and devotion in everyday activities of life, such as eating. So it's not a new problem, this idea that, I do my religious thing. Maybe that's to go to worship on the Lord's Day, Sunday morning, give God an hour or so, and then I can live my life however I want to without any thought of God. And God said, no. Even something as basic as what you eat is, and your meals, that is part of your devotion to me. And we would say as Christians, it's not just what we do when we're gathered at the church. It is how we do our jobs, how we relate to our families, how we deal with friendships, what kind of a neighbor that we are, really 24/7 of how our spirituality, how our relationship with Jesus is to be lived out. So even to come down into the nitty-gritty of what you eat is kind of a way of saying God needs every part of your life, and our devotion to him should be reflected in this. I will remind us also that while we're kind of free from some of the restrictions of the dietary laws because we are New Testament Christians, the New Testament does say that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so we want to take care of our health, and what we eat is a big part of that as we honor this wonderful creation in our physical bodies that God has made. So we will note that, okay? We look at some of the principles here. First is this: God permits more than he prohibits. And there's a list here of the animals you can eat. Your animals you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. And in our study, sometimes people had to look up some of these critters that are named here. So that can be some of your independent work if you want to look up and see exactly what some of these animals are. But we can get caught up a lot in what God says not to do. Don't do this, don't do that. And we can give it a whole lot more attention proportionally than the idea of what God does permit. You can go back to the Garden of Eden story, and God says there's all kinds of fruit from all kinds of trees, and there's one tree, stay away from that. And then, we know how the story goes. We can be that way. He says, don't do this and don't do that, and we can forget that. Look at all that God permits. Look at all the freedom that He grants us. Look at all that is available to us. And so let's keep that perspective in mind, that God permits more than He prohibits. But there are some things that are prohibited, and I'm going to put some categories. God prohibits all types of animals. And it's interesting as we read through these verses, it's the land, the sea, and the air that are all represented. The list includes land animals. So verses 7 and 8. However, those that chew the cud or have a divided hoof, you may not eat the camel, the rabbit, the hyrax. Although they chew the cud, they do not have a divided hoof. They are ceremonially unclean for you. The pig is also unclean, although it has a divided hoof. It does not chew the cud. You are not to eat their meat or touch their carcass, and as we've noted there. But we're glad we live on this side of the New Testament because bacon tastes so good. Maybe not the most healthy thing, but we're happy that we do get to include bacon in our diet. So there are this list of, there's the livestock, the land animals. Then we have water animals. All the creatures living in the water you may eat, any that have fins and scales, but anything that does not have fins and scales you may not eat, for it is unclean. And I got to talk to some of the people who fished a lot in our classes, and they said, what fish are out there that don't have fins and scales? Catfish is the one that came to mind. In one of my tours of the Holy Land, we talked about certain fish in the Sea of Galilee that does not have fins or scales. And they said, it's the happiest fish in the lake. Because if anybody catches it, they just have to throw it back because you can't put it in part of the diet. So there's water animals, and then there are birds. You may eat any clean bird, but these you may not eat. And here's the list: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, black kite, any kind of falcon, any kind of raven, horned owl, screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the cormorant, the stork, or any kind of heron, the hoobie, and the bat. I'll quickly note that a bat really is a mammal, not a bird, but we'll keep it on the list there. Partly the commentaries have thought that these are birds that tend to be scavengers and may tend to scavenge off of dead animals. We've already talked about how the dead animals or dead bodies are something you're not supposed to touch, and so if you had one of these birds, you might inadvertently be handling something that's dead because they had themselves handle things and how they scavenge their food. So that's a possibility of why some of these make this list. And then finally, the list includes insects. All flying insects are unclean for you. Do not eat them, but any winged creature that is clean, you may not eat. We had a great discussion about, did anybody ever eat an insect? And some said not on purpose. Something flies in your mouth. We did have Vacation Bible School Challenge for the offering some years, and told the kids if they reached the goal, we would eat some chocolate-covered crickets. So I have eaten a chocolate-covered cricket before. Sometimes a toddler will come in, eat a bug. They find a bug on the floor or something, and be proud of it. So we don't have to worry too much about this one, do we? That we don't have to worry about what we can and cannot eat. So we kind of get these categories. I've gone through them fairly quickly, but I note this conclusion still, even though we can say maybe it's pagan worship, maybe it's because they are tending to be in contact with dead bodies or something else. Still, there is a mystery as to what animals are prohibited and which are permissible. And we'll just leave that into the mystery of God. But this was part of the way they were going to be distinct, the Hebrew people, from their neighbors. For those who had occupied the land before, it was going to be that here's what you eat, and it's going to be different, okay? And then one more thing about animals. All animals found dead are prohibited for them. but it was be okay for the others. Do not eat anything you already find dead, you find already dead. You may give it to a foreigner residing in your towns that they may eat it, or you may sell it to any foreigner. But you are a people holy to the Lord your God. And so we joked about roadkill. Don't go after that. But that was, again, the idea of don't touch anything that's dead. We studied a couple weeks back about the importance for the meat that they would have to have all the blood drained out of it. It's likely if you find a dead carcass that it still has some of the life blood that was in it. And so try to keep respect of that. And so this prohibition that is granted there. So even Jews weren't permitted to touch dead bodies and be ceremonially unclean for that. So this is part of the caution that comes. It's still in the mystery, but this is the caution that we have. So there's the diet things that are shared and be distinct. We go on in chapter 14. The next topic he talks about is in their generosity, in their tithes and offerings. In your generosity, because money talks. And what is it saying? And Jesus himself said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So what's going on with that? And he puts in a formula that is there for them to show generosity, a system to support the public worship, and also help others out. So first, the generosity is to the Lord. Be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks, in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. Again, Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. And so you put some of your treasure at God's house, into his work. Then some of your attention is going to be there. Somebody compared this. You buy some stock. Every once in a while, you're going to look in the paper, you're going to look on your app, you're going to look how the stock market's doing, look up that particular stock and see how it's performing, because some of your treasure is there. And so that draws your heart to those things. So you put your things for the Lord's work. I oftentimes say this in our church, that people give to the Lord through the church. You don't give to the church necessarily, you give to the Lord. But it does go through the church, or it goes through the ministry of the kingdom work that you are gracious enough to financially support. And before we move on, I just want to make mention. He said, you're going in this land, it's going to be fruitful, there's going to be produce, there's going to be harvest. And so because you are graced and blessed, you have something to give. And if you weren't graced and blessed, there wouldn't be anything to give. So it all belongs to the Lord. It's kind of getting closer. We pay more attention to our taxes right now. And my granddaddy, my father's father, my dad was born in 1930, so he lived his childhood years through the Great Depression. And my grandfather, his dad, never minded paying income tax. We may not like it, but my granddad never did. He had a great perspective, because he said that meant you had a job. And so he knew plenty of folks who would like to have a job who didn't have a job. And so, that they were blessed with that meant the taxes would be paid. You've been blessed with material things, then you have the means through which to be generous and share. So giving to the Lord, we put it into his work. We know our heart will follow those places where we devote ourselves to him. Then there is a tithe that goes to your neighbor. It's next to your neighbor, really kind of your neighborhood. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners and the fatherless and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied. And so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. But we can break that down in a few ways. Lots of qualities to how this special giving would take place. One is for your towns, in your own backyard. Store it in your towns. Said sometimes charity begins at home. It shouldn't end there, but I'm pretty confident that if charity doesn't start at home, if you're not willing to give and be gracious and generous in your own backyard, those who are closest to you, you're probably not going to go beyond your backyard. So that's a novel thing. It starts there. It mentions the Levites, who were the Hebrew people who were working the temple. They didn't have an allotment of land for that tribe. They were scattered out among all the tribes. And so they were going to require, in doing the Lord's work, they require some of the support out of the charity of the people. So we have that there. It mentions, second, It is for the disadvantaged. We see there the foreigners, the fatherless, the orphans there, the widows that are mentioned, especially in that culture. They had a tough time in those situations of making it economically. And so it was provided some graciousness that would go out to them. And finally, that it would return a blessing. That last phrase, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Now, here's a conviction that I have, I don't mind sharing, is that I believe, practicing here a principle of the tithe, if you will be honoring God in that way, He can make that 90% that's left go a whole lot further and grow a whole lot more than if you kept the whole 100% to yourself. I know that doesn't sound mathematically plausible, but I really believe that God does those things. And so that it says there, the Lord will bless you. Now, my question is, I don't want to be preaching prosperity gospel and say, give to the Lord so He can give back to you and suddenly you be rich. So the motive is important. So I ask you this question. Do you give to get, or do you give to give even more? God, if you'll bless me, I'll turn it around and I will use it even more so. And there's a more noble motivation, isn't it, than just as a means to receiving, because that can be guilty of manipulating God. I'm using a generosity, God, so you'll have to reward me in some way. And that is well off the page of what God intends to give. Jesus talks about this return that comes through the heart that gives. Give, and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So give to God, give glory to God, receive that. It helps bring out a better place within us. It helps fight off greed. The Bible speaks many times, many more than we want to acknowledge, many times about greed. And one of the ways that we can rise above the tendency we all have to be greedy and to keep and hold is to be generous. And if we're giving enough away, then that old greedy miser in us will tend to be quieter and to die down. I'll give you a quote there from Richard Foster, who was a very popular writer. I know some in the 80s when I was in seminary. He said, "Giving with glad and generous hearts has a way of rooting out the tough old miser within us. Even the poor need to know that they can give. Just the very act of letting go of money and some other treasure does something within us. It destroys the demon greed." And that's a good thing. So that's part of the generosity, trying to create a certain people that aren't so caught up. Jesus said you can't serve God and mammon, God and material things. So the way you do that is you can let go of material things and you hold tightly to the Lord. Remember we said earlier in the very first passage from the 14th chapter of Deuteronomy here, that God had chosen them as a treasured possession. It reminds me of something as we come to a conclusion that we find in the book of 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. There's that word holiness that applies to us. A holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Where it says God's special possession, the King James Version says it's God's peculiar people. Now, I didn't find any other translation that used that word, but I kind of focusing on it. God's peculiar people, because, to be honest, I don't like being called peculiar. You're peculiar. It means you're odd or strange or something wrong with you there. But God said you're a peculiar type of people in the right way, in the holy way. It's okay, those distinctions that say we're not like everybody else. Our life and our lifestyles, honoring God, are going to be different as we look at these things and also some of the other topics that we will share. Again, back in verse 2, it says, the Lord has chosen you to be His treasured possession. You see back in 1 Peter, it says God's special possession. And I don't like to be called peculiar, and I don't like to be said that somebody possesses me. I'm owned by somebody. We don't like to hear that. Say to our boss, you don't own me, or somebody who's exercising authority, you don't own me. But God has the right to own us. And the best place we can be is to be called in His possession. Now, I asked in our studies with our classes, These questions, some religious groups are recognized for their peculiar dress, diet, and lifestyles. And then I asked them to name some. And of course, the Amish people who dress in a particular way, and they don't drive automobiles, and they don't have utilities in their homes. That's a very obvious one. We know, I can see them, you recognize them because of that, right? The Midianites, to some degree, the same. You can talk about people from non-Christian faiths, the Jewish people, the Hasidic Jews, for example, of how they dress in the black, and the men in the big black hats and beards and the curls. You see that, and you kind of recognize what those things are. So we don't called upon to wear a certain dress in these matters, but I hope that we would be distinguished, that people wouldn't have to know us too much to know, boy, there is something that's different. The way they approach things, the way they have values, the way they see life, their worldview of things is different because this person is a follower of Christ. So how should we be recognized? Certainly in that vein. And we'll talk in the weeks ahead about some of the other things that Moses is telling the people that is going to make them, as God's treasured possession, a holy people. This is Jay McCluskey. I've enjoyed walking through the 14th chapter of Deuteronomy with you. We'll continue next time. God bless.